And we're going to resume our service. Today's reading is Rays of the One Light, weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Nayaswami Kriyananda. Dogmatism versus common sense. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness within your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 7, Jesus warns, "Beware of the false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Ye shall know that by their fruits do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles. Even so very good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit." Excuse me. "Wherefore by their fruit ye shall know them." Jesus here, as indeed many times during his teaching, counseled people to use their God-given common sense and not to rely on high-flown but undemonstrable claims. Common sense goes beyond abstract reason, for it is rooted in actual experience. Even common sense, however, is deficient when the judgment called for goes beyond sensory experiences. Ultimately, what he emphasizes always, therefore, was intuitive perception. Thus, he expected more of his disciples than crude common sense, and often scolded them for being too literal-minded, as he did elsewhere when they thought his statement, I have meat to eat that you know not of," meant that he had steaks or sandwiches secreted about his person. His reference, of course, was to spiritual, not material substances. Worlds, even though appearing in the scriptures, are no substitute for direct experience of truth. Therefore, the Bhagavad Gita says in the 2nd chapter, "The sage who knows God has little need for the scriptures, as one might have for a pond when the whole land is covered in flood." Thus, through the Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
And we'd like to extend a special welcome to all those who are visitors or guests, whether they be here with us today or on the internet, and especially those who have come for the Expanding Light this weekend and for the programs here. And it's like we're almost have a spring day today. Even. Thank you for joining us on this special occasion of our Guru's conscious exit from his body. I'd like to start with a reading from Whispers from Eternity. This is Yogananda's poem, God's Boatman. I want to ply my boat many times across the gulf after death and return to earth's shores from my home in space. I want to load my boat with all those waiting thirsty ones who have been left behind, that I may carry them to the opalescent pool of iridescent joy, there where my Father distributes his all desire-quenching liquid peace. Oh, I will come back again and again, crossing 1,000,000 crags of suffering, with bleeding feet I will come, if need be 1,000,000,000,000 times, as long as I know that one stray brother is left behind. I want thee, O God, that I may give thee to all. I want salvation, and I may give it to all. Free me then, O Lord, from the bondage of this body, that I may show others how they too can free themselves. I want thine everlasting happiness, but I want also to share it with others, that all my brothers may find the way to happiness forever and forever in thee. So 58 years ago today, on March 7th, 1952, Paramahansa Yogananda was at a reception, a dinner for the ambassador of India in the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. And he got up after dinner to give his discourse, and he spoke about the ties between India, the newly independent India, and America, and how he saw his vision for both those countries to work together to move forward into the future. And he recited his poem, My India. And when he finished with the words, Ganges, woods, Himalayan caves, where men dream God, I am hallowed, my body touched that sod. And when with the word sod, it trailed off into a long exhalation, and he collapsed on the floor, and he was gone. It was the end of a 60 years or so of life, a very short life, but he chose that moment as his conscious exit. His mission was finished, and the disciples came rushing forward. They tried to revive him. They chanted Om in his ear, and aside his right ear, as they had done other times when he had gone into Samadhi, and they were trying to bring him back to them. But this time, there was no bringing him back, and they knew that. Swami Kriyananda was there. He knew that. He knew there was no bringing him back. And Dayamata was there. Dayamata, who was one of his chief disciples, Master had told, Yogananda had told Dayamata that day, he said, my mission is only going to be for another few hours. In a few more hours, this body will be gone. So they knew, they were prepared, but it's hard to be prepared for when your teacher, when your guru, when that soul who has guided you has left. And they all took time to say goodbye, farewell to the body. The body was laid out back at Mount Washington, and they, one by one, the disciples came in. Dayamata in particular spent a lot of time there that evening, and while she was there praying to Master, a tear fell down Master's cheek from the body, and she gathered it in a handkerchief and told the other disciples. And gradually they came to accept that indeed the mission of their Master in the body had ended. And they tuned in. They knew, of course, the teachings that he'd been teaching them for 30 years was that the body is just a vehicle, that the consciousness is what lives on. And so they gradually came to know that. But there were also outward signs that helped them on their way. The body, they left the body open, not sealed in a casket or not through any preparation for burial for up to 21 days, because they thought some disciples were coming from India and they wanted to see the body for the last time. And at the end of those 20 days, there was no sign of corruption at all in the body. The body was as fresh and alive, and the life force was still there as much as it had been when he was alive. And as far as we know, the body is still in that condition in its crypt in Los Angeles in Forest Lawn Cemetery. But no, Yogananda also appeared at times to some of his disciples. There was one disciple, the door opened and he walked in as if he was still alive, he was still in his body, to comfort that disciple. Other disciples, he comforted them through visions, through words. There was one time when after the body had been interred at the Forest Lawn Cemetery, where all the disciples were standing around and some were weeping, and there was one disciple in the back who was saying, Master is not really in there. And at that point, she heard very, very clearly his voice, I'm not in there. What are they weeping about? And so he was there. He reaffirmed it. His consciousness lived on with that. And that's what we celebrate today. We celebrate that life, that consciousness that moved on. As it said in the poem, this is only one of many lives. We talked about, I will come again and again, crossing a million crags of suffering, with bleeding feet I will come, if need be, 1 trillion times. 1 trillion times, that's a lot of lifetimes. Even if they're only short 50 or 60 lifetimes, coming back 1 trillion times, that spans over many days of Brahma, many manifestations of the universe and many dissolutions of the universe, out and back. And that consciousness, that being, Yogananda, is coming back. Kriyananda has written, he said, I have reason to believe that he's come many thousands of times already. He gave us a glimpse during his life of some of those lifetimes. He mentioned that he was 2.5 millennia ago, he played the role of Arjuna, the disciple in the Bhagavad Gita that Krishna teaches the blessed science of yoga. He said that about 1,000 years ago, he played the role of William the Conqueror, a fairly more outward political role. He came from France and conquered England, and what he did was set up a new government, a new way of thinking, that brought people into a new age. And Catherine Van Houten has just finished a book looking at that life and possibly the role that Swami Kriyananda played in that life too. He also gave us some hints of some other lives. He said he was in Spain some centuries later as a commander in Spain who was charged with the job of driving the Moors out, driving the Muslims out of Spain. We think maybe it was Fernando Tercero. We don't know. He just gave us a glimpse of these things. At one point at Mount Washington, there was a rattle and a racket one night, and it sounded like clanking of metal. And the disciples the next morning asked him, "Master, what was that?" He said, "Oh, it was one of my old soldiers who came back and who had asked me for liberation. And it was a soldier who had been with him at the time when he was a Spanish general and was asking for him to be released, and came back. And Master said, I released him, and he went back." So the Master has played many, many different roles over the time. And what we're focusing on is one little glimpse of that role. He was an avatar. It means he said, "I killed Yogananda long ago. Only God dwells in this body now." So it just came back to serve, just came back as a direct channel of God's consciousness to be with us, to teach us. But we want to focus in a little bit when we think of this life. We're not going to remember all the trillions of lives because we don't know about those. What we're going to talk about is one life where he played as Paramahansa Yogananda. And what was his role in that life? And it's interesting because it ties in very well with what we were talking about in the readings. The readings are talking about the role of the scriptures and how we need intuition and common sense as well as the scriptures, and how can that work? And it was interesting, Yogananda came in the 1920s. He came to America. He came to a land that was just feeling its oats, so to speak. It had finished the First World War. It became a world power. The gospel of science, of practicality, of industry was ruling in this country. And Yogananda came, and he could have spoken about the scriptures. He could have started with that, as many others did, but that wasn't what he was trying to do in this country. He brought a very, very practical teachings, a teaching that stretched into every part of daily life, a teaching of common sense, a teaching of that would grab Americans where they were with that do it now, can do kind of a spirit. And he knew that was what he needed to do. In fact, he was ushering in a whole new age, a whole new way of looking at spirituality, of seeking God. It wasn't just through an interpretation of the scriptures. Now, he could have done that. If you look at his guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar, he called a Gyan avatar, an avatar of wisdom. And he focused a lot of attention on the scriptures, on interpretation, on knowledge. We read in the autobiography of a yogi that he used to spend all night doing discourses on various aspects of the teachings. And Yogananda said, I would meditate at the feet of my guru and just hear his flow of supernal wisdom flow out through the ages, throughout the whole night. And in the morning we would walk by the Ganges. Yogananda didn't do that when he came here. He didn't do any all-night discourses. He didn't talk on and on about the scriptures. What did he do? He came and he brought something that he called the Yogoda lessons, is what he started with. Da means that which confers yoga, that which confers yoga, or as he translated it, harmony and peace and inner realization. This was the Yogoda exercises, which later became known as the energization exercises that we teach today, are his unique contribution to the science of yoga. So he brought what he thought was the central core of this, and it was the control of energy in the body and sending the energy throughout the body to be able to heal the body, to be able to control that energy, and eventually bring it into the spine and bring it up to the spiritual eye. So he came with Yogoda lessons. And it's great to see some of the titles he put on some of his courses that he gave in the 20s. He had the super conscious that's it, thank you. The super cosmic science course. And he had another one which was the new course in practical metaphysics. So practical and science. He had those right in his pamphlets. And what did he talk about in those pamphlets? He talked about how you can heal yourself, what the right diet is to do, how can you change your behavior, how can you concentrate better, how can you have better relationships, how can you have success on the material plane. He didn't talk about the Upanishads and Asham Pramnati Samadhi and where it was in here. And he was talking about very down to earth, very practical things. And again, this is not, the only thing that could have happened in those times. I mean, you look at other saints. Anandamoyi Ma was born. He was a contemporary of Master's. She stayed in India. She founded no organization. She wrote no books. She would talk about the scriptures, but she didn't give long discourses either. She didn't even want to feed herself or clothe herself. I mean, it was a very, very different incarnation that was not Master's. And it's a very telling story about Master's introduction to his first disciple, which was Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis was a Bostonian dentist, and Master had come to Boston in 1920, invited by the religious liberals to give a discourse in a congress about the unity of religions. So what did Master talk about at that discourse? He talked about the science of religion. He didn't talk about all the scriptures, all the Vedas, all the Upanishads, all the vast knowledge that came behind them from India, which is probably what the organizers of that conference thought he was going to talk about, because after all, he was a Hindu. They invited him to represent Hinduism. But he talked about the science of religion. He said, it's simple. We're all seeking the same thing. We're seeking happiness. We're seeking to avoid pain. And the answer to all our problems lies in finding the divine. That's it. That's his teachings. And it was very, very well received. It was like a breath of fresh air that came into the scene of religious dogmatism and religious things. And after the lecture, he stayed in Boston, and he gradually made connections with people there, and he met students of metaphysics and started teaching them and started talking to them. And Dr. Lewis was, again, he was in his mid-20s, late 20s. He had a family. He was a dentist. He had grown up in a typical New England family of, New England is where they've had 300 years of Puritanism and of fairly dogmatic teachings in religion. And Yogananda chose this place to insert his new energy. So at the urging of a friend of Dr. Lewis's, his friend said, who became Yogamata, said, you really need to call Swami Kriyananda. You really need to meet him, because they had studied some metaphysical teachings and they were really interested in answering these teachings. And Dr. Lewis was skeptical, and he had heard, these Indian fakirs, and they're trying to fool us, and I don't know, I don't want to be fooled. I just, I want the truth. I wanted this. And finally, he agreed to call up. So he called up Yogananda, who was staying in this rooming house, and he made an appointment. He made an appointment for Christmas Eve, 1920. So he went to the house at the appointed time and climbed up the stairs, and he said, I was wary. I didn't want this man to take me in or anything. And when he opened the door, he realized that he had actually seen this man before. At some point a couple months earlier, he had seen this orange flash going across the square in Somerset in Boston. And it turns out it was Yogananda. He was dressed in an orange robe with an orange turban, with puttees, with yellow sandals, and he was moving it at or yellow shoes. He was moving at quite a high speed. And Dr. Lewis remembered looking at him and going, what is that? But he opened the door, and lo and behold, there's Yogananda, still dressed in his orange robe and an orange turban. And they walked in, and they both sort of smiled at each other, a knowing smile, saying, we're checking each other out here. And so they started having discussions about various things in the scriptures, things that Dr. Lewis had read and he didn't quite understand, and some Eastern teachings. And at one point he finally said, there's this passage in the Bible that says, if thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be filled with light. Do you know what that means? And Yogananda said, I think so. He said, have you experienced that? And Yogananda said, I think so. Said, can you show me that? And Yogananda said, a little later, I'll show you that. So the discussion went on, and Yogananda decided that, okay, this was, they both decided they'd trust each other a little bit. And then, in the words of Dr. Lewis, Yogananda then procured a tiger skin from somewhere in his room. So he brought out a tiger skin, laid it on the floor, sat himself down cross-legged on the head, and motioned for Dr. Lewis to sit down cross-legged opposite him. And Dr. Lewis said, no, I've never sat down cross-legged in my life before. It's not something we did, and I can assure you I wasn't the lotus posture, but somehow I managed to get down cross-legged in front of Yogananda. And then Yogananda looked at me with his intense eyes that we see in his pictures, and he said, will you always love me as I love you? And Dr. Lewis said, I was a little taken aback by this because no one, no one had ever quite spoken to me that way. But I could see something in his eyes, and I knew, and something that said, made me say yes. And when he said yes, Master then broke into a big grin, rubbed his hands together and said, great, now I can take charge of your life. So then they sat down together, and he instructed him in the practical techniques of meditation. And so they did a little meditation together, and he helped him quiet his mind. And then Yogananda took Dr. Lewis's head and put it right next to his head, spiritual eye to spiritual eye, and he showed him the spiritual eye. And Dr. Lewis said, all of a sudden the darkness opened up. I could see the golden ring, the blue field, the white star. I felt my body moving into that star. I felt my consciousnness lifting. And I knew then that this was a real teacher, that this man knew God. Later in that same time, he showed him the 1,000-petal lotus on the top of his head. He said he could see rays extending outward all throughout the universe. He said he could see the veins at the base of his brain with the blood flowing in it and the little cosmic life sparks in the blood of the prana flowing through there. And when they finished, Yogananda said, if you promise never to avoid me and to follow my teachings, these experiences will stay with you. And Dr. Lewis, our Bostonian dentist, sort of staggered out of there a little bit dazed. But he did. He followed Yogananda for the rest of his life. And he was his first disciple. He was one of his principal disciples. After he raised his family, he moved later out to Encinitas and to San Diego and served the work out there for a long, long time. And it's interesting that first meeting is sort of indicative of the way Yogananda worked. He didn't beat around the bush. He showed people. He gave people a direct experience. After 3 years or so in Boston, he left Boston and he said, I must go west, I must lecture. And he went out lecturing, and he filled conference halls all over the country. He filled the biggest auditoriums. He met the president. He met the governor. He met all the celebrities. But in those lectures, he wasn't doing an interpretation of the scriptures or just going on. He would come running onto the platform full of enthusiasm, full of life. He would teach people to feel that power, feel that enthusiasm. He would give people demonstrations of the physical power of yoga. He would give people direct perception of the devotion of God. I mean, he didn't spend in Carnegie Hall, when he filled Carnegie Hall, he didn't go on for an hour and a half about the Bhagavad Gita. He went on for an hour and a half chanting, "Oh God, beautiful." I mean, imagine, he had people there in a hall in New York in the 1920s. They chanted, "Oh God, beautiful" together for an hour and 20 minutes. He gave them that direct experience, that direct perception. And again, he created groups all over that they studied the Yogoda lessons, the Precepta lessons. He gave them practical techniques that they could use in their everyday life, that they could put into practice to get that direct experience. And then the period of his life, his campaigns, toward the end of the 20s, finished in 1925. He found the property of Mount Washington, it's called the Mother Center. And gradually he went out less and less. And he decided that he needed to gather those who were truly sincere about the teaching. He needed to gather his disciples around him to go to the deeper teachings. And it was a difficult time. They didn't have much money, and he wanted them to found an organization to figure out how to make this work, how to make this practical, how to make this go. Because a master, he had other means at his disposal for raising money. I mean, we read about, they had to eat only tomatoes because that's what they grew on the hillsides, and the payments, it was difficult to get them. But, think for a minute here. This is a God-realized master. Think of Trilanga Swami in the autobiography of Yogi. Trilanga Swami was a 300-pound Nagu sadhu that lived in Benares, and he had a little niche in his temple, and he could put his hand in his niche and take out whatever he wanted. He could take money, he could bring out food, he could bring out trinkets, he could bring out whatever he wanted for his disciples. Yogananda could have done that. As a matter of fact, there's some interesting stories about some times when Yogananda did show those powers. There was one time somebody came to the master in Mount Washington and said, "Well, you know about spiritual things. You're pretty good with that. I'll give you that. But what about the material? You're not very much of a success on the material plane." And Yogananda says, I will make you $5,000 in 2 weeks if you do what I say. And the man said, okay. He said, I'm from Missouri, show me. So Yogananda said, most people live on a very superficial level. I live behind that. When you go behind what's happening in this material plane, it's all one. There's a cosmic oneness in there that we can tap into, a sense of intuition that we can read. So I prayed, Yogananda said, I prayed deeply to Divine Mother to show me how I was going to do this. And I got a vision of a lot of little houses. So then he said, well, then I needed to keep acting. I didn't just sit in my bedroom and wait for Divine Mother to shower the $5,000 out of the ceiling onto me. I bought a copy of the Sunday Times. And I went and looked in the Sunday Times, and I found those houses. And I said, okay, go buy these houses. And the man said, well, I don't know, that's a little sketchy. That doesn't look so good there. And he said, don't put any of your negative thinking in front of me. You will manifest this if you do this. So the guy went out and he bought these houses. And what happened? 2 weeks later, there was a real estate boom. These houses suddenly became the in place to be. The man sold the houses and he made $5,000. So Yogananda had that power if he wanted to, but that isn't what he wanted to do. He wanted to teach his disciples to be practical, to use their common sense, to do what they needed to do. And he showed things in little ways. I mean, there's some amazing stories. Like he said, I was responsible for the idea of thinking of lids of toilet seats. Now, that's not usually what you think of avatars getting into. But he said, no, I had that idea because it's more sattvic, and I planted that idea in the right place. And he also said he invented the gear shift on the shaft of the steering wheel. I mean, this is literal. He and some disciples made a prototype. They drove to Detroit, and they handed it off to the automakers, and they took it from there. But Yogananda, had this idea and acted on it. I mean, intensely practical, intensely showing people how they could follow through with these things, and how they could do these teachings. In his later years, he moved into a little bit less of an outward role. He did do commentaries on the Gita, on the Bible, on other scriptures, but very practical ones, bringing them in for a new age, because Yogananda was truly an avatar for the new age. And as you know, or some of you know, and if not, I'll tell you about it, we are moving into a new age. The Yukteswar taught that there are great cycles of time called the yugas. And as our planet moves in our galaxy, sometimes it's closer to the center of the galaxy and sometimes it's farther away. And this is a cycle of 24,000 years. As it moves closer to the center of the galaxy, there's more cosmic radiation that arrives at Earth, which uplifts all of humankind. That makes it easier to realize God, easier to live in that way. Well, we were coming out of the period where we were the farthest away from farthest away from the center of the galaxy. And we are moving now, in about 1900, we moved into a Dwapara Yuga, or an age of energy. This is the time when Yogananda came. He really brought a new dispensation, a new way of teaching, a new way of looking at things. It wasn't contradictory to any of the past, but it was a new practicality, a new way that was adopted to this age, a way of doing things that we could bring in. And he brought these teachings in right at the time when we were shifting into this energy. And it really is a work that's meant for the whole age, the whole yuga. It's not just a little group of disciples. It's not just a monastery. It's not just about a few people in Los Angeles for a few years or until we remember them. This really was an energy that was launching a new way of looking at the science of God realization. And there's a number of things in his teachings that are important for us to remember and that are keeping with these trends in Dwapara Yuga. One of them is an emphasis on the individual. And in the past, you have ministers or religious teachers trying to build big congregations, big churches. What did Master come to do? Master came to bring self-realization. The emphasis was on the individual. He said every individual himself or herself must make love to God. It's between you and God. Sure, satsanga, being with truth seekers, can help, but it's really that interior one-on-one connection, that individual experience of God, that individual striving, that individual longing for oneness. Because after all, you don't realize God as a congregation. You realize God one by one. So it's that emphasis on the individual, which is a harbinger of the Dwapara age. There was also an emphasis on simplicity. We talked about, not getting into all the esoterica of all his definitions and this and that. I mean, it's something that'd be very fitting to the American consciousness, actually, the definitions. And you look at some of the earlier masters that came. Vivekananda, for example, came around the turn of the century, the same time. And he was a master whose guru was Ramakrishna. And Vivekananda was an incredible intellect. That once they gave him the Encyclopedia Britannica to read, or one of the encyclopedias, he read the whole thing through in a week or so, and then could answer any question on any article on any part of the whole encyclopedia. So pretty big intellect there. And he came, and what came from his time in America was the Vedanta Society. And the Vedanta Society is doing wonderful work, but what did they put first in their organization? Vedanta, the Vedas, the scriptures. And I don't really know that much about them, and I'm sure they're a wonderful organization. I did go to visit them when I was first getting on the spiritual path, and there was a part of me that liked to think that, if I could get enough knowledge and enough definitions, that I was getting realized. So, at one point, it definitely spoke to me of, all these definitions, and there was a lot about the interpretation of the scriptures, and not so much about yoga and meditation. But it was dry. There wasn't a life there. There wasn't the life that we found coming to Ananda or to one of these organizations. So it isn't a given that that's the way they're going to teach, but this is what Yogananda brought, that individual experience. He also brought simplicity. The simplicity, basically you could take Master's teachings and say, okay, what is the essence of Master's teachings? Love God, practice Kriya Yoga, serve your fellow man, serve God and others. I mean, that was basically it. It was pretty simple. Love God, practice Kriya, serve others. And that was his message over and over and over and over again. It was simple. It's a teachings for the new age. It's not difficult. Another of the trends of Dwapara Yuga is the emphasis of quality over quantity. And again, it's that depth of meditation. It's that true experience. It's that really living the life. It's not how many devotees we have, how many people on the mailing list. He said, I love a crowd of souls, or I love a crowd, but I prefer a soul to something like that. I love souls, but I prefer a crowd of souls. And he was focused on the individual. He would speak to his lectures. He would zero in on the one person in that whole room who he knew had that spark, who could practice these teachings, who would later become a disciple. Out of thousands. Out of the thousands he lectured to, who came in the end of his life? There were a handful of disciples. There weren't many. There were a group. There was, monastics. There were some householders. But the ones who truly stayed with it were few. And it says in the reading today, we judge the tree by the fruit. You will know by the fruit you shall know thee. Look at the fruit. Who were his disciples? That was the fruit of the tree. Rajasi Janakananda was an incredibly accomplished, practical businessman. He had a CPA and a law degree by age 25. By age 29, he was the head of the biggest insurance corporation in the Midwest. By his 30s, he was a multimillionaire who had been into oil and railroads and insurance. And he was a self-made man. He was the perfect American dream. He said he was miserable until he met Yogananda. He became Yogananda's chief disciple. He reached God realization in this lifetime. Sister Gyanamata, read her letters in God Alone. If you want intensely practical advice, read Gyanamata's letters. They are right to the point. Love God, practice Kriya, serve others. It's right there. Look at it, and of course, a founder of this community, Swami Kriyananda, an intensely practical, active person. Kriya means action. Kriya Yoga, it's an action. Kriyananda, bliss through action. And look at all he's brought us. He's brought it, the practicality of these teachings from Master through him out into this world, out into this, to create this community and for this next age. So just remember the Dwapara Yuga, those ages, this is what he brought. But in the final essence, we tend to think of trying to put, again, Yogananda in a little box. And he was the avatar for a new age. And this energy, this work, is going forward with us or without us. And I remember very clearly Dharmadas, Nayaswami Dharmadas was here a few years ago when they were helping Swami found the work in India, Swami Kriyananda, our community founder. And he said something in a satsang. He said, well, when Kriyananda was basically on his deathbed, when he was very sick, Dharmadas came in there, and Kriyananda said to him, Dharmadas, we just have to remember. I want you to always remember, this isn't my work, this isn't your work, this is Babaji's work. This is a work that is destined to come in this age. We can cooperate with it, we can be part of it, we can be blessed by what comes through that. But this will happen regardless. This is going to happen. This is an inspiration for a new age. And Yogananda, that life, those 60 short years that he was here, that was what he was doing. He was launching a new ray, a new infusion of light into this world. And what we as devotees really share, the one thing that really unites us, that tells us where we want to go, it's a subtle attunement to that ray. So there's a new ray. It's not about gear shifts on the cars. It's not even about the Yogoda lessons. It's about attunement to that ray. And that's how we will find that. It's that cosmic consciousness that's there. Yogananda is always living in that cosmic consciousness. He's there now. He's there right now, right around us. And we can just tune in to that cosmic consciousness through him. And that is going to be our salvation. That is going to be what's going to take us in this time across this river of delusion. We can cooperate with it and be a lot easier, or we can not cooperate and it's going to be a lot slower. Fortunately, we're all here. We're ready to cooperate with it. And I just wanted to, there was an interesting image that came, and this, I'll leave you with this analogy, when I was thinking about the guru and various lives. And that's like, if you think of below us or underneath us, around us, there's this great treasure down in the earth, this great treasure of cosmic consciousness, of everything we're always been looking for, of oneness in God. But we're stuck up here on the surface, and we're kind of floundering around in the mud of delusion and sense attachments and material desires. And, we try to do a little digging because we know there's a treasure down there, but we don't get very far before it caves in, and we don't really know what we're doing. Well, the avatars, the great ones, come, and they're like mining engineers. They're the ones who come and they show us, dig here, and I'll show you how to dig, and I'll show you how to shore up that tunnel, and I'll show you how to get through the rock of your past karma, of your past bad habits. I will bring you all the techniques. I will show you where the best place to look for those veins of self-realization are. And I will be there in the front of the tunnel. I will be there leading the way for you. And what happens? There's a few who believe, and they go into the tunnel with a master, and they dig, and they get a nice long shaft going, and pretty soon other people start to come, and they see, wow, there is a path here. This does look better than just floundering around in the mud up here. And of course, there's lots of other books out there that's showing you where the Buddha mine is, and where the Christ mine is, and where the Zoroaster mine is. And some people go and they say, oh, that looks better over there. I'm going to go over to that one. But there are others who just keep following. And at some point, the guru or the mining engineer takes us to a certain place where we can touch those veins of self-realization. And then he leaves. He's gone. The body's no longer there. He's no longer in the tunnel with the lamp. But the tunnel is there. That tunnel is there. There are people who have followed him are still there. They still know the techniques. They still know how to dig. They know how to shore up the tunnel when it collapses. And his knowledge is still there. If we tune in, we know where to search for those best veins. We know how to follow that path, how to follow that tunnel. And it takes our energy. It takes our effort. The guru didn't just dig the tunnel and all of a sudden it comes out as a wellspring. We have to keep hauling that rock out. We have to keep busting through those hard rock areas of habit, of karma. We still have to find our own vein of self-realization. But the tunnel, the way is there. It's been shown by the guru. And he'll come again, and he'll probably dig another tunnel somewhere else. But we have a mine in front of us, a mine that will lead us to oneness in God through Yogananda.